Daryl?
He looks like any other boy. Looks can be deceptive.
General, the machine becomes human when you can't tell the difference anymore.
What am I?
An experiment that's about to end.
The Youth Life Form project as of now is terminated.
Movie action with Daryl next Saturday at 6:55 on BBC1.
Another loose interpretation of the week's events. Have I got news for you on BBC2 very shortly. A feud between the Cromers and the Prestons seems on the cards at West Beach in half an hour on BBC1. First, Sharon and Tracy go green in Birds of a Feather.
What'll I do when you are far away?
Big trouble in a small size.
Nobody's ever made such a fuss about a bath.
Give us you!
Careful, Shane.
Starry eyes.
Take it easy.
And broken hearts.
You say you don't want me. I don't want you.
Men, they're not worth the space they take up.
Growing Pains, Wednesday at 8 o'clock on BBC1. Yes, that's Life's Back with Bilbo, the hero hound who saved his family. And tonight, the Sunderland couple who've been driven out of their home by thugs.
Each man was armed with one of these.
Victimised because they helped the police. That's Life returns, tonight at 10:10 on...
In Tales of Rock and Roll, BBC2 shortly takes a walk on the wild side, revealing the true shady origins of this classic rock song among the people who frequented Andy Warhol's studio. Drama here on BBC1 now, and another bitter feud between the warring families of West Beach.
Sunday on BBC1 and a whole series of very strange events. Starting at 7 o'clock.
What are we listening for?
Will you be quiet? I think she's singing.
You know that Betty's singing?
I swear I could hear her singing.
God, I think that's the most sinister thing I've ever heard.
Well, if he thinks that's sinister, what would he make of this?
They all said it was the crayfish, but what about the red paint on the banister? Or that horrid little book about how to embalm a corpse? I mean, if it comes right down to it, what happened to the arsenic?
And Murder Most Foul is afoot in Provence in October, the actual shooting season.
Hey, they might think you're a robin.
They don't shoot robins.
Not yet.
So it's look out, Charlemagne, your days might be numbered. Not to be missed, Sunday on BBC1.
The victimisation of people who've helped the police will be one of the stories reported by Esther Ranson. That's Life in 20 minutes. Now at 9:50, the news and sport on BBC1 with Michael Burke and David Davies.
A suicide bomber has assassinated the president of Sri Lanka. He killed the president and at least 14 other people at a May Day rally. Riots in Moscow. More than 150 people have been injured at an anti-Yeltsin demonstration. And a man's being held over the murder of a mother and her baby in Luton. Good evening. The Sri Lankan president, Ranasinghe Premadasa, has been murdered by a young suicide bomber. It happened at a May Day rally in the capital, Colombo. A huge explosion killed the president and at least 14 other people, most of them his bodyguards. Police blamed Tamil separatists, but the main guerrilla group, the Tamil Tigers, said they hadn't done it. Tonight, the streets of Colombo are reported to be deserted. Police and soldiers are being deployed to stop rioting.
Runner singer Premadasa was a populist to the core, and it was no surprise to find him mingling with the crowd. The president, who once described himself as the humble servant of the common man, was issuing last-minute instructions for the May Day rally to the end.
He signalled the procession to go, and then he stood by and organizing another procession which came on the byline to join the main procession. And immediately there was a bomb blast.
The result, an all-too familiar scene of carnage in a city that has seen more than its fair share of killings recently. At least 14 people have been killed and many more injured. Eyewitnesses say they saw a man running towards the president. The explosives are thought to have been strapped to the assassin. The suicide bomb is a favourite tactic of the Tamil Tiger separatist movement, and it must surely be on the list of suspects. The movement has denied involvement, and in truth it's not clear that any alternative president would be more amenable to the Tamils. But causing mayhem may have been goal enough. The assassination comes just days after the murder of an opposition leader and rival to Mr. Premadasa. At the time, many accused elements in the president's ruling party, giving rise to rumours that today's killing may have been a political reprisal. Certainly, Mr. Premadasa was not short of enemies. In a quick show of authority and unity, the Prime Minister, Mr. Dingiri Wijatunga, was sworn in as acting president. But splits may occur when members of parliament get down to electing a new president.
There'll be a power struggle because right now there's a vacuum. Prime Minister Wijatunga, who took over as the acting president, is politically very weak. He doesn't have a base in the country, so he's not likely to be a contender for the leadership.
As the first president from Sri Lanka's lower castes, the late president enjoyed substantial support among the poor. The government will be hoping they'll stay calm once the initial shock has worn off.
A man's been shot dead in West Belfast at the home of a Sinn Féin councillor. He was carrying out repairs at the front of Councillor Alex Maskey's home when gunmen opened fire. The outlawed loyalist terror group, the Ulster Freedom Fighters, admitted they carried out the attack and said they intended to murder the councillor.
The attack happened just before 6 o'clock this evening. A man was working on renovations at the home of Alex Maskey when two gunmen, apparently armed with rifles, got out of a car and opened fire on him. He was hit several times but managed to get into the house, where he died a short time later. Alex Maskey is one of Belfast's leading Sinn Féin councillors, and a previous attempt on his life was made during the 1987 general election campaign. This evening, Sinn Féin members were suggesting it was no coincidence that this attack comes in the run-up to local elections later this month. The illegal loyalist terror group, the Ulster Freedom Fighters, said they'd planned to murder Mr. Maskey, but made no apology for the death of his friend. The Sinn Féin president, Gerry Adams, watched as Alex Maskey asked the police to stop their follow-up work, a protest that the dead man's body had not been taken to a funeral parlour. The UFF said that recent meetings between Mr. Adams and John Hume, the leader of the main nationalist party, the SDLP, had made them more confident that what they called a pan-nationalist agenda was being operated. In the eyes of the loyalist group, the IRA, Sinn Féin and the SDLP represent the same thing, and it underlines the seriousness of the threat it poses. Dennis Murray, BBC News, Belfast.
Around 150 people have been injured in Moscow in clashes between riot police and protesters staging a May Day demonstration against President Yeltsin. More than half of the injured were policemen. It's the worst violence in the capital since the failed coup attempt in Moscow in August 1991.
3 former communist leaders, 2 of them standing trial for the 1991 coup attempt, were among the marchers. It soon turned violent. Protesters commandeered trucks being used by riot police to block their way and drove them into the police ranks. A furious battle broke out and a policeman was crushed between trucks as they careered out of control. It was the worst street violence in Moscow since the communist coup 2 years ago. More than 100 people were taken to hospital, though early reports of deaths have not been confirmed. The violence spiraled as the police used water cannon and the demonstrators set fire to trucks. The police were armed with truncheons, but the protesters' flagpoles were longer and just as effective. This was Boris Yeltsin's nightmare. Just as he embarks on a cautious dialogue with his more moderate critics, the hardliners used today's events to announce what they called a war against the regime. And not just with stones, but with weapons. Tension remained high late into the afternoon as the demonstrators regrouped behind makeshift barriers here at the Russian parliament, their hatred for President Yeltsin now stoked higher than ever. Angus Roxburgh, BBC News, Moscow.
The American Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, has said that President Clinton has decided on stronger action in Bosnia, including what he called military steps. But Mr. Christopher said no details will be released until he'd had discussions with European leaders. He's in Britain tomorrow to see John Major.
It was decision day at the White House, the president's security advisers gathering for a final session after weeks of hesitation on Bosnia. And despite continuing warnings of dangerous repercussions for the US, the administration has now committed itself to a policy which includes military action.
At this meeting, the president decided on the direction that he believes the United States and the international community should now take in this situation. This direction involves a number of specific recommendations, including military steps.
Selective airstrikes on Serbian military targets are one option now open to the White House. Lifting the arms embargo against the Bosnian Muslims is another. And Washington is making clear that even if Serbia now signs the Vanso-in peace plan, that alone will not be enough to avert US action.
They must stop bombing the cities in Bosnia. They must permit humanitarian aid to go forward. There's no mystery and no secret about that. The Serbs know that what they must do. Our course of decision is well set here. The clock is ticking.
Mr. Christopher is flying to London tonight to try to secure Allied participation. And President Clinton may be facing an uphill battle with US public opinion seemingly opposed to military intervention. Martin Sixsmith, BBC News, Washington.
In Athens, leaders of the warring factions in Bosnia have begun their emergency meeting. The main aim is to get the Bosnian Serbs to sign the Vanso-in peace plan.
It's threats that brought the Bosnian Serbs flying into Athens. Economic isolation and military menace have combined to force them to reconsider a plan they'd already rejected. The peace negotiators think they're on the edge of signing.
Peace, which has so long eluded the former Yugoslavia, is now, I think, within our grasp, if only everyone has the courage to seize it. And I hope this conference sets the tone and the spirit for, over the next few days, a final conclusion and an acceptance of all parts of the peace plan.
The conference diplomats believe they've opened up a split between Serbia and the Bosnian Serbs. Certainly, Serbia's President Milosevic totally ignored the Bosnian Serb leader Radovan Karadzic. President Milosevic has told the Bosnian Serbs they're harming Serbia. They should settle for what they've got. Although the two delegations were seated side by side, they exchanged not a word. But everything still hangs in the balance. Diplomats fear that if Washington talks too much about what it's planning, it could force the Serbs back together, or even encourage the Muslims to back away. If all goes well, the conference will end tomorrow, and the peace plan will go back to the Bosnian Serb parliament for approval on Wednesday. Then NATO will have to find 60,000 troops to enforce it. Brian Hanrahan, BBC News, Athens.
In Bosnia itself, 15 people are reported to have been killed and up to 60 wounded during heavy shelling of the capital, Sarajevo. And on a joint patrol in central Bosnia, the UN commander, General Philippe Morillon, and Colonel Bob Stewart of the Cheshire Regiment have found further evidence of atrocities.
United Nations forces once more on the front line in the new war between Muslims and Croats. Weapons are at rest. The ceasefire is holding as it has for the past 2 days. Neither side expects it to last, and when they fight, they demand that the United Nations get out of their way. In the village of Jelinek, Muslim fighters lead UN troops to the spot where they say 3 of their people have been shot and burned, all civilians. Croatian forces insist that the victims were Croats. It's impossible to know.
I'm very sorry to hear this. And when were they shot?
The UN commander, General Philippe Morillon, paid his first visit to the area since fighting broke out in central Bosnia 2 weeks ago. He spoke of the importance of the Athens talks, generally held here to be the last chance for peace under the present UN mandate and force structure. He also saw the evidence of the latest atrocity.
Shame for the human being, generally speaking. The fact is that atrocities have been committed here.
The two commanders ended their tour with a visit to Mackenzie the Bear, once the showpiece of a local restaurant, now on the edge of no man's land. With an international campaign to liberate him, he has a better chance of escape from Bosnia than most. Martin Bell, BBC News, Central Bosnia.
Here, a man is being questioned by Bedfordshire police about the killing in Luton yesterday of a young mother and her 7-month-old baby. David Edwards was arrested early this morning in London.
21-year-old David Edwards was brought to Luton Police Station this morning. Police began a massive hunt for him yesterday, and he was eventually arrested in the early hours of this morning, walking beside the River Thames in London. Officers have been questioning him all day.
I'm just here to confirm that a man answering the description of David John Edwards was arrested this morning, during the early hours of this morning, in the City of London by two City of London officers, and that a shotgun has been recovered.
Yesterday afternoon, 22-year-old Marina Turvey was walking in this street near her home in Luton when she was shot in the head by a man armed with a shotgun. The man then grabbed her 7-month-old daughter Charlene. He threw her in the back of his van and drove off. The baby's body was later found on farmland near the Bedfordshire-Hertfordshire border. She also died from gunshot wounds. Police have been questioning witnesses all day, and they say charges may follow later tonight. Adam Minot, BBC News.
France's former Prime Minister, Pierre Bérégovoy, has been taken by helicopter to a Paris hospital after a suicide attempt. He'd shot himself in the head and is said to be in a critical condition. Earlier reports said he'd died. Mr. Bérégovoy was Prime Minister for almost a year until the Socialists' defeat in the March general election.
It's less than 5 weeks since Pierre Bérégovoy waited at the Prime Minister's official residence in Paris to hand over power to France's new Premier, Edouard Balladur. He'd been in office less than a year, not long enough to turn the tide and prevent the Socialists suffering their worst election defeat for a generation. He'd been finance minister. He had a reputation for prudence and orthodoxy. He kept the franc strong and money tight. And because of that reputation, it was the more damaging when questions were asked about an interest-free loan from a businessman later charged with corruption. At first, the Élysée Palace said that he was dead. Later, it was announced that he's alive, but in a deep coma and being taken by helicopter to a military hospital near Paris. Waiting for him there is his old friend and ally, François Mitterrand. Stephen Jessel, BBC News, Paris.
Here, Labour is calling on the government to abandon its plans for rail privatisation, following the leak of a government document that warns of higher fares and cuts in services. The Liberal Democrats say the leak should kill off the flawed plans for privatisation.
Critics of rail privatisation have argued that selling off the railways will push fares up, lead to cuts in services and be too complex to work. This leak indicates that one of the government's own senior transport advisors issued a similar warning a month ago. The man who's expected to become franchising director warns that looser fare controls will be needed and that there may be a serious cost in terms of efficiency and value for money. Sources say the document was not seen by ministers but was discussed by civil servants.
Here we have the man handpicked by the Tories to see this thing through, telling us now that it is going to result in higher fares and fewer services. And I think that brings the whole public, and it certainly should bring Tory MPs face to face with reality, and this whole madcap rail privatisation, rail fragmentation scheme should be abandoned now.
I believe that we will go forward with this piece of legislation, that it will get on the statute books, and that private investors will be attracted to come in to provide the services that are currently not being provided by British Rail, and the passengers will benefit.
The Department of Transport say there are always plenty of documents circulating and the debate's moved on since this particular contribution. But there's no doubt that it is embarrassing for the government. Rail, one of the last privatisations, is also proving one of the most awkward. Mark Mardell, BBC News, Westminster.
Sport next, and with news of a sad day for one of football's most colourful characters, here's David Davis.
In his last season as a manager, Brian Clough has seen his Nottingham Forest team relegated from the Premier League. They were beaten 2-0 at home by fellow strugglers Sheffield United. It was an emotional day for Forest manager, who'd announced his retirement only last Monday. He was rapturously received as he took his seat at the City ground. But the game provided more misery after a miserable season, and after 18 years at Forest, this wasn't the way he would have wanted to go. 3 teams will be relegated. Middlesbrough, who beat Sheffield Wednesday, and Oldham could both save themselves. Crystal Palace had a crucial victory over Ipswich. Neither of the top clubs played today. Manchester United have the chance to become champions in the next 48 hours. Norwich improved their prospects of a UEFA Cup place by beating Liverpool.